Hello and welcome to the first of two lectures on the Progressive Movement. The Progressive Movement was a wide-ranging reform movement of the early 20th century up to about 1920. It's not one movement, but the sum of many reform movements with different people and organizations focusing on different aspects of society. But one commonality is the optimistic belief that humankind can improve and that the government is the best instrument to effect change. It took place at all levels of government, at city level, state level, and at the national level as well. It involved both men and women and all people of American society, African Americans and whites, native born, and immigrants as well. And it's going to change the United States forever with 4 amendments to the Constitution and an expanded role and powers of the executive branch, which is why I've chosen a photo of Teddy Roosevelt as the symbol of this period. He very much embodied the spirit of this movement and the energy of this movement as well. So, as a reform movement, this is of course not the first one we've seen. We've seen previous reform movements such as the antebellum reform movement focusing on abolition of slaves, temperance, these kinds of things, and then also, the populist movement as well, which is really a forerunner to the progressive movement. And we'll see reform again, such as FDR's New Deal or Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society of the 1960s, and we'll see, counters to those reforms, such as, Ronald Reagan was very much a counter to Lyndon Johnson's reform movements of the 1960s. Now, if we just want to compare a little bit to these earlier mid-century reforms and the progressive reforms, and then to the populist to these reforms, the mid-century reforms had very deep religious roots and led by Christian women coming out of the Second Great Awakening. And it was sort of self-improvement. You lead by example of you being a good person and, taking care of yourself and self-responsibility, and then encouraging others to do so as well. So moral improvements and issues included, as we said, slavery and abolition, women's rights, education, these kinds of things. And there was also the utopian communities, such as, the Mormons as well. Now, the early 20th century, it's a variety of people and motivations, as we said, and it was spurred not necessarily by Christian elements, though there are some. There was very much an investigative journalist exposure to it as a spur to all of it. The goal is not to self-improvement, but to strengthen the state, use the government to enact change, and so it's improvement not of the self, but social, economic, political improvements, and issues corruption, industry, urban growth, poverty, those problems that are coming out as the rapidly industrialized and the rapid urbanization and the problems that were associated with those. So if, the major change that's going to coming out of this is that to use the government to effect change, if we look at where on the political spectrum the United States was before the progressive movement, they were way over here on the right towards a laissez-faire, which was very popular in the Gilded Age, especially amongst the upper classes and the middle classes. But there's going to be a big shift on the economic spectrum of the political spectrum, away from the right and more over to the left. Now, not all the way over to, like a socialism, but there's definitely a swing, like a pendulum shift on the spectrum away from that. So if we compare, the populists and the progressives, there's a lot of differences between these two. The populism was very much, a rural phenomenon, and it's the poor and uneducated people who, see that something's wrong and that they're being cheated in some ways, but they're not able to express just what it is, or and they come across as being radical and very emotional as well, because they weren't able to very effectively organize. They're on the outside looking in. They're on the outside of power and looking into, the areas of power and wanting to affect change. But they are on the outside looking in, and they felt frustrated, they felt betrayed by the inability to bring proper control to the railroads and to secure, cheap credit and cheap money. Now, they did make a big push in the election of 1896, but were not able to achieve success and had very minimal gains. And just to remind you, uneducated, I don't mean they're stupid. There's more of they hadn't had the opportunity. Now, the progressives, it's very much in the urban areas, as the United States has made that shift, a permanent shift to the cities, with more than 50% now living in the cities. Middle class are leading the way, and an educated middle class. They're moderate people. They're not calling for big revolutions or big changes. They're very rationalistic. They're data oriented. Let's look at the data and let's try to apply smart ideas to fix that problem. They're very rationalistic and pragmatic. In fact, their philosophy we could even call pragmatic. They're on the inside of power, looking around at what's going on around the world and wanting to bring change to that. What do I mean by on the inside? Well, people like Theodore Roosevelt, who holds power and looking around, what can I do? Or somebody like Jane Addams, who's also has considerable voice. And these were people that had obtained the American dream, of opportunity, and they don't want to tear down the system, but let's look at the problems and let's fix the problems. So the roots of it, there's a lot of roots to this one, and this is really a reform movement like no other. We sort of looked at, what do they want to fix up? Those economic corruption, the inefficiency in society, and the social injustice, and also consumer protection, environment, and by social injustice, children should be in schools, not in the factories, and these kinds of things, and strengthen the state to do so. So it's got a number of roots. They're populist, and many of the populist ideas are going to come about during this time. The social gospel, I'll talk about that later. Women and feminists, people like Victoria Woodhull, Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony. Writers, and particularly journalists, and the universities. There's a lot of them coming out of the universities. These are data-driven, pragmatic, rational people. And it's social and economic problems have become very complex, and they're sort of recognized by these progressive people that the hands-off, laissez-faire thinking is not going to solve the problems, and charity in the churches are not going to be able to solve them. The problems are too big. What can solve these problems are the governments. And to create a new kind of check and balance within society between government and capital, and they've seen that there's been a little bit too much of an imbalance here with government helping capital and bringing labor on as an equal partner as well. And some of the leaders of the progressive movement, Jacob Riis, Theodore Roosevelt, who were friends, very close together coming out of New York City, and Jane Addams. And we've seen these people before, and with Jacob Riis especially, of somebody who lets expose the problems, and he used the power of the camera to do so. And the journalist. And today we would call these people investigative journalists. And they were called muckrakers, a derogatory term, but they're exposing, and that's what they're setting out to do, to investigate corruption in society and report it. And the magazines, like McClure's magazine, which is a very good example of this, they were able to finance some of these investigations, which take time. And, this is a person who's going to be out investigating for a long period of time, up to a year or even longer, and needing some financial backing. And the magazines were looking for that big scoop, that big story. And it's Theodore Roosevelt who named them the muckrakers. Some examples. If you need to pull up some examples, these are three good ones. The Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens. He was exposing the corruption of the machine politics in state and city governments. The granting of large contracts to build a bridge, and then much of that contract is sort of taken away through corruption, and some of it kicked back to the politicians who had awarded that contract. The History of the Standard Oil Company by Ida Tarbell, and exposed the business practices of John D. Rockefeller. Her father had been destroyed by Rockefeller, and they never really understood what had been going on during that time, and she sort of got curious and started investigating it. And The Treason of the Senate by David G. Phillips, exposing corruption in the Senate level. And there's one more called The Jungle, which is maybe the best example, but we'll look at that when we get to that one in time. And many others, exposing lots of other plights of African Americans, child laborers, medicine in quotation marks, lack of safety, corruption at all levels. Now, these people, they're great at exposure, not so good at providing solutions. But people who are pretty good at providing solutions are reading these. There's Ida Tarbell. All right, so we want to strengthen government. And so there was very much a push to having more government and more power in people. And we see some of these with some of the things that they're advocating at all levels of government. First off, primary elections, which is people having more choice in selecting nominees for senator, for the congressional seat, for the president. The initiative that a citizen can propose, get a new law, get enough signatures on a petition, and then bring it up for a referendum. You see these in the United States elections today. Some recent examples have been about getting marijuana legalized. California had one a few years back of allowing same-sex marriage. And each election year, there's a number of these initiatives that are on the ballot, and the referendum is the people voting directly yes or no to them. The recall, you've elected a senator or a president, and then it's discovered corruption or just unsuitable to hold the office. Well, let's get rid of him. And maybe the most important is the Australian ballot, which was a political initiative that came out of Australia, obviously, in which you vote privately in a booth with a curtain, and nobody can see who you voted for, which previously, they gave you like a little piece of paper or something else, and you went and you dropped it very visibly into, a different can, and so there could be intimidation of, make sure you vote for the right person, or, and so now you can vote secretly and not have that sort of intimidation. There's a push for direct election of senators. Senators were elected by the state governments, and that was something that the populists had been urging for. And, of course, a boost for women's suffrage movements as well. Now, these changes to the nature of U.S. politics are about putting more power into the hands of the people, and the advocates of these changes were well-educated people who thoroughly believed in the capacity of people to do good, to act and think rationally, and to do best for the greatest number of people, as opposed to how they saw government behaving, which was to do what was best for a small group of insiders and corporations at the expense of ordinary citizens. And the direct election of senators runs counter to the founding fathers' lack of trust of the people and their goal to keep power out of the people. All right, so we're going to look at the city and the state levels of progressivism and what went down there. At the city level, there was definitely a growth of cities, and so there was more understanding that they required proper management and to take politics out of city management and take private ownership of utilities and put it into the public ownership of utilities. And the idea of the city manager comes out of the pragmatic philosophy of the progressive. A city is like an engine, and it needs engineers to properly manage it. Utilities like clean running water, sanitation, planning, parks, schools, electricity, transportation, etc., etc. These need smart, educated people to run it, not career politicians with their patronage providing party machines. And urban reformers pushing to clean up the cities, clean up the slums, the prostitution, the corruption, and the police, and the local taverns. And the taverns were seen as sort of the headquarters of the political machines, and also linked with, of course, drinking and prostitution. So there's a lot of push for that. And Americans were looking at similar efforts that were going on in the great cities of Europe that had also undergone very quick growth, and Paris leading the way in sort of an urban beautification project. And so within the cities, it became more of what you know, and as opposed to who you know. What you know of, running a utility, as opposed to having a person in a position of power who can provide you with a job. And at the state level, it's a good example. If you need to pull up an example, is Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, and sort of his plan, which, first off, he agreed with all the previous things we saw with the expansion of power to the people. That was one aspect of it. So that was going on at the state level, and different states were following Wisconsin's lead. And then, if you got to be data driven and do what's pragmatic and rational, well, then there maybe should be a symbiosis between the universities and the government, with the universities providing that research and providing sort of advice on policy, and university research could be applied to solve problems within society and to the benefit of everybody. And the University of Wisconsin, particularly their campus at Madison, is considered one of the more liberal ones today, still even. Also a very reputable history department. And a good quote about this sort of method of doing it by Adlai Stevenson, who would run twice unsuccessfully for president of the United States in the 1950s against Dwight D. Eisenhower. He said of this plan, it meant a deep conviction that the role of government was not to stumble along like a drunkard in the dark, but to light its way by the best torches of knowledge and understanding it could find. All right, and finally, progressive women. And there's one there, Florence Kelley. And their involvement, came out of that traditional reform movement, especially in the settlement houses and helping immigrants and the poor, people like Jane Addams, and the social gospel, which is thinking of like, what would Jesus do? And so somebody like Jane Addams, women in reform, is nothing new, but there's certainly a reinvigoration of women in reform. And somebody like Jane Addams had been closely associated with the settlement house movement going back to the late 19th century. She was one of these advocates of what would be called the social gospel movement, which is deeply concerned with issues like economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, crime, racial tension, slums, unclean environment, child labor, inadequate labor laws, poor schools, and also she was very much a pacifist and strongly advocated the United States do not join war. And their social gospel is, what would Jesus do? Do what's right, morally right. And they would take the quote from the Bible, from the Lord's Prayer, which has the line, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Which is, if you want to be up into heaven, you gotta bring heaven down to earth first and improve society down here. Now, the social gospel is not necessarily a belief shared by all women or all women progressives, nor the movement as a whole, and they wouldn't necessarily all identify with it, but there was a shared conviction amongst all women progressives that they had a civic responsibility to help others and to improve society, which is the argument that they're making, that the reform movement was really an extension of their role as wife and mother. Factory reform and temperance, very much key to these women. So let's just look at those quickly. Florence Kelley, who we saw on the previous slide, she led something known as the National Consumers League, advocating for better conditions for women and children workers in particular. And there's going to be a key court decision at this time known as the Mueller v. Oregon, where the Supreme Court rules that, the case was, Mueller was the owner of a laundry business, and she had her female workers working more than 10 hours in a single day, which was against Oregon law, and she was fined, a small fine. But Mueller appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court and then to the U.S. Supreme Court, both of which said that the law is fine. And we'll have a look at the reasoning in a moment of why they felt that law was okay. And so the idea of the 10-hour workday sort of gets set in. Louise Brandeis, who argued on behalf of Oregon, He would later be named to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. The temperance movement, what's old is new again, and alcohol, major problem. A lot of the language you might see with the war on drugs today, that it destroys families, it destroys individuals, and it's bad for all. And the saloons and the pubs and the politics were closely associated with prostitution and with corruption and the machine politics. Close down the saloons, you close down the party machines, and you'll end prostitution. And the women's Christian temperance movement was very instrumental, as was the Anti-Saloon League. And a lot of counties, cities, and states became dry, and no alcohol for sale or manufactured. But at a national level, well, that'll come too with the 18th Amendment, and culminates, this bottom-up movement and a push for the 18th Amendment, which wasn't very effective. We'll get to that when we get to that. So this is from the decision, the Mueller v. Oregon decision, and they wrote that woman's physical structure and the performance of maternal functions place her at a disadvantage in the struggle for subsistence is obvious. This is especially true when the burdens of motherhood are upon her. Even when they are not, by abundant testimony of the medical fraternity, continuance for a long time on her feet at work, repeating this from day to day, tends to injurious effect upon the body, and as healthy mothers are essential to the vigorous offspring, the physical well-being of women becomes an object of public interest and care in order to preserve the strength and vigor of the race. And we see in this the language of the decision. We see social Darwinism. Women who work won't have as good of children or won't be able to care for children very well, which hurts our race. Male paternalism and sexism, that women are obviously at a disadvantage. But we also see the progressivism, that having women work less hours benefits the public interest. What's good for all is rational, so we should go ahead and have a law that's saying that we can have less working hours for women only because of the special position of women in society as mothers. All right, finally, a disaster that occurred during this time, an industrial disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, and this gave women labor rights and the need to improve the safety of all workers. It was made much more abundantly clear by this. It killed over 100 women in a fire, many from jumping to escape the fire. The fire was in a tenement workshop in New York City, a sweatshop, and the managers had locked the doors to prevent the workers from slipping out for a break. And when the fire started, there was no escape, and it shocked the country, and it led to really high, loud voices calling for improvements, and those improvements came. And so you got a lot more safety inspections and the building of fire escapes and fire codes in these more professional, better managed cities. So it's on this unhappy note that this lecture comes to an end. The next lecture will look at the progressive movement at the presidential level. All right, thank you very much for listening.